Imagine a Soviet city where people live normal lives. Factories are working, children go to school, and buses run through the streets. But this city does not appear on regular maps. Its real name is not used in public. To enter or leave, you need a special pass. The people who live there know it is better not to say too much about their work, or even about the city itself. This is not a prison. People were not forced to live there. In fact, many wanted to live behind this closed border. Today, we will look at why the Soviet Union needed cities that officially did not exist, and what life was like beyond their checkpoints. One of the most famous cities of this kind was Sarov. For the outside world, it was not Sarov for a long time. It was Arzamas-16. This was one of the main Soviet centers for nuclear weapons development. But Sarov was not an exception. Around the atomic project, an entire network of closed cities began to appear. Some were built almost from scratch. Others were created from existing villages and small towns. The reason was the new reality after World War II. After the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it became clear that the world had changed. If the Soviet Union did not have its own atomic bomb, the country would be in a dangerous position. Former allies were quickly becoming rivals. On August 20th, 1945, the Soviet leadership created a special committee for the atomic project. This was not the beginning of the program from zero. The first work had already started during the war. But after August 1945, the project received top priority, direct control from the highest level, and enormous resources. An atomic bomb is not created in one laboratory. Behind it stands an entire system: uranium, reactors, plutonium, testing, security, transportation, storage facilities, housing for specialists and factories. Building a facility like that next to an ordinary open city would have been difficult. The people, cargo, equipment, security, roads, rail lines, and power lines would have been too visible. So the secret was not only the facility itself, the secret was everything around it. If thousands of people had to live near a secret facility, build it, operate it, and guard it, then a factory was not enough. The state needed an entire closed city. These cities were usually built in remote places, or in places that were easier to isolate. That made it easier to guard the facility, control information, and hide the scale of the work. There was another side to this. Nuclear and defense industries were dangerous, so they were kept away from major population centers whenever possible. In practice, this often meant that the risks were shifted onto the residents of the closed cities themselves and onto nearby villages. Since these facilities were secret and extremely important, the people who worked there were chosen very carefully. Scientists, engineers, designers, technicians, and other needed specialists were searched for across the country and transferred from institutes, laboratories, and factories to atomic or defense projects. But closed cities were not built only by the best specialists. In the early years, military builders and mobilized workers were sent there, and sometimes prisoner labor was used as well. Once the city began to function, its population really did form around people the state trusted with secret and highly important work. For these people and their families, a closed city became a new home. It was not a prison. In fact, many people wanted to get in. The reasons were easy to understand: prestige, stable work, important projects, and a higher standard of living. Closed cities were often supplied better than ordinary Soviet cities. In a country where shortages were part of everyday life, this mattered a lot. It was easier to find food and goods there that could be rare in an ordinary provincial town. These cities also often had good schools, hospitals, clubs, and cultural centers. Street crime and everyday crime were usually lower. The city was cleaner, calmer, and safer. But this was not generosity from the state. It was a calculation. The Soviet Union needed to keep specialists in places where they could not live a normal, open life. So the restrictions were balanced with privileges, and the restrictions were real. Checkpoints, guards, document checks, and sometimes fences, barbed wire, and watchtowers. Without permission, it was impossible to enter. Getting a pass could be difficult even for relatives of residents, let alone outsiders. Free visits by foreigners were completely out of the question. Closed cities were not all the same. This was not a network of just 2 or 3 places behind high fences. The Soviet Union had dozens of closed cities, towns, and restricted territories. Not all of them were connected to the atomic project. Some served the nuclear program, others worked for missiles, the Navy, the space program, military electronics, the chemical industry, or testing grounds. The level of secrecy also varied. Some places had a real security perimeter with checkpoints, guards, fences, and barbed wire. In others, the regime was softer and looked more like control on the roads leading into the city. Even the names of these cities were part of the secrecy system. The real name might not be used in public. Instead, the city received a code name: Arzamas 16, Chelyabinsk 40, Tomsk 7, Krasnoyarsk 26. The system usually took the name of a nearby large or better-known city and added a number. That number could be connected to a postal box, a military unit, or an official code address. In this way, the secret city was hidden behind the name of an ordinary Soviet city. Sarov became Arzamas 16 to the outside world, even though it was not located in Arzamas itself. Ozyorsk was known as Chelyabinsk 40, and later as Chelyabinsk 65. Seversk was called Tomsk 7. Zheleznogorsk was Krasnoyarsk 26. These names hid the real location of the city and did not reveal what it actually did. At the same time, inside the Soviet system, the city still had an address. Mail, cargo, and documents could still be sent there. A good example of another type of closed city was Mirny, in the Arkhangelsk region. It was connected not to the atomic industry, but to the space and missile program, because the Plesetsk Cosmodrome was located nearby. The regime there was softer than in the most secret atomic centers. Control still existed, but the city was not as isolated as Arzamas 16 or Chelyabinsk 40. That is why places like this sometimes attracted people from the surrounding area. Supplies were better inside, and some people tried to get in for reasons that had nothing to do with official work. Closed cities were built around facilities connected to some of the most dangerous parts of Soviet industry: nuclear weapons, reactors, radiochemistry, missile technology, testing, and waste storage. Good schools, clean streets, and better supplies did not change the fact that dangerous production facilities could be located nearby. In places like that, a mistake or an accident could have huge consequences. The best-known example is Chelyabinsk 40, later known as Ozyorsk. The city was built near the Mayak plant, one of the key facilities of the Soviet atomic project. Mayak produced plutonium for nuclear weapons. For the country, it was an object of enormous importance. For the people nearby, it meant living next to a dangerous industrial site. In the early years of the atomic race, safety often lagged behind the speed of the project. The state needed nuclear weapons as quickly as possible, and environmental consequences were not always the main priority. From the late 1940s to the mid-1950s, radioactive waste from Mayak was discharged into the Techa River. People lived along its banks and used that water in everyday life. The contamination affected dozens of settlements, and some villages were later evacuated. In 1957, one of the largest nuclear accidents in history happened at Mayak. A tank containing highly radioactive waste exploded, and a radioactive cloud spread across the Ural region. The accident became known as the Kishtim disaster, because Chelyabinsk 40 itself was a secret city and could not be publicly named. This was the main contradiction of closed cities. The system gave many residents more stability, safety, and everyday comfort than ordinary Soviet cities. At the same time, it could hide risks that people learned about too late, or never learned about at all. That is why a closed city cannot be described in only one color. It was not a prison, and it was not a perfect Soviet paradise. It was a complicated bargain, better conditions, pride in important work, and life next to facilities about which even the residents themselves did not always know the full truth. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, it might have seemed that closed cities would disappear along with the Soviet system of secrecy. But that did not happen. Some cities received their real names. Arzamas 16 became Sarov again. Chelyabinsk 40 and Chelyabinsk 65 became Ozyorsk. Tomsk 7 became Seversk. Krasnoyarsk 26 became Zheleznogorsk. Cities that had once seemed not to exist were back on the map, but they did not become completely ordinary cities. In Russia, places like this received an official status, Zato, or Closed Administrative Territorial Entity. It was no longer just a secret Soviet postal box, but a territory with restricted access. You can read about the city, you can find it on a map, but you still cannot simply go there without permission. The reason is simple. The facilities these cities were built around did not disappear. Nuclear centers, defense plants, military bases, missile sites, and space facilities continued to operate in the new country. The 1990s were a difficult test for many closed cities. Soviet funding and supply systems were falling apart, and cities that had depended for decades on a single secret enterprise faced salary delays, money shortages, and uncertainty. Closed cities did not disappear with the Soviet Union. They simply changed form. They went from almost invisible cities with code names to official restricted territories. They are no longer as mysterious as they were during the Cold War, but they are still separated from ordinary life by a system of access permits.